can't believe it's already 2025. Now, I do want to make something very clear, okay? When it comes to, of course, eternity, we know that time and space does not, and matter and motion does not apply. But for us who, of course, we measure time in seconds and minutes and hours and days and years. Well, here we are in 2025. It was interesting. I was having a little conversation with someone just yesterday about the fact that here we are, 25 years later from, of course, Y2K. Y2K, everyone was concerned about things, exploding and, all the different computers that were running the world would all of a sudden shut down, all because they were not designed to go into, of course, 2000. Well, we know that that didn't happen, but here we are 25 years later, looking at a brand new year. Now, the interesting thing is if you were back, let's say, in the 60s, for example, the Jetsons were set in 2025. Well, we're not flying through the air. We haven't got average person does not have, for example, a android or a robot in our home taking care of us. And we don't have escalators going across the sky, and we're not flying off to the moon or to some other planet to be able to have a vacation. So we're not quite there yet. And we're also not currently in the Terminator type of era yet. We could get there yet, but right now that's not happening. But we are in a exciting time. And the reason why I say it's an exciting time, because, for example, in the United States, we have a brand new president who is coming into power, Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has always been a lightning rod type of individual. And he's got some plans that are going to affect the entire world. So that should be very interesting. Also, as well, in my country of Canada, it's entirely possible that we could find ourselves right now in a new situation in my country. Either way, of course, we need to be looking forward to that which is ahead. Now, last night, my family and I, what we did, of course, is we ended up, having some time together. My habit has been, ever since I gave my life to Christ, was, of course, to pray in the new year. So there I was with my son and his two daughters and his wife and my wife sitting there, and we prayed in the new year. And of course, we did the countdown, 10, 9, 8, and we welcomed in the brand new year. Now, what does this really mean for us? I mean, all kinds of things it could mean for us. Well, I want to give you a little thought here from Philippians chapter 3 that Paul says we should be looking at. Now, this is what he says in Philippians chapter 3. He says simply this: not that I've already attained or I have become perfect, but he says, I do press on to hold that which Christ took a hold of me. So basically, he's saying this. He says, brothers, I forget that which is behind, and I strain for those things which are ahead. 2024, very interesting year. I mean, two of the major events that are happening right now and kind of piloted themselves through 2024 was, of course, the war in Ukraine, which was a war that you have to understand, Europe had not had any wars for decades. Then all of a sudden, Russia made the decision that they were going to attack, of course, the area of Ukraine. Now, you have to understand, as far as the Russian perspective was, Ukraine had been a part of the Russian Empire since 1797. Okay, in 1797, the Russian leadership decided, well, we need to have, this source of, food. And the Ukraine is very much like my country of Canada. Canada has a large section of what we would call the Western provinces. So the provinces of Manitoba, the provinces of Saskatchewan, and the province of Alberta are basically the breadbasket of North America. We have vast tracts of land where farmers produce, of course, crops. My son happens to be one of those farmers. He farms along with his father-in-law, who, of course, is a good friend of mine. They, at one time, farmed about 5,000 acres. Now they still farm about 4,000 acres. My own son, Ryan, actually has 340 acres, and he does both canola and barley. And also as well, he has hay crops, and he has cattle, and he has sheep and a whole bunch of animals along that lines. So in the mindset, of course, of the Russians, they needed that particular type of food source. And so that was one of the reasons why they went and invaded the Ukraine back in 1797. Also as well, they needed a fresh water, or what we would call a warm water port. And so what they did, they took that part of Crimea, which doesn't always get cold. And the port that they have there from the sea, the Black Sea, of course, is the ability to be able to get their goods, of course, to around the world. So that was the reason why they did that. Now, back in 2014, Vladimir Putin, sorry about that, Vladimir Putin basically said, you know what, we got to, get this. Now, you have to understand, there are parts of the Ukraine, like Crimea and the Donetsk area and the eastern provinces of Ukraine. The majority of the people that live there are actually Russian. And so as far as and they cried out to Russia and they said, listen, we don't particularly like what's going on in Ukraine. And so what we want you to do is come and, help us. So that's why Vladimir Putin basically started annexing certain parts of the Ukraine against, of course, international law and international rule. But he's not all that concerned about international law and international rule. So in the mindset of the Russians, of course, this is part of, the greater Russia. And all they're doing is getting back what belongs to them. Now, of course, if you are a follower of events, okay, and that means world events, you know that back in 1917, there was a big revolution under Lenin and Trotsky, and they basically took Russia and made it a communist country, okay? And if you follow communism, it's the collective, everybody is considered the same. Well, we know it doesn't work like that way. Anyway, back in 1939, Mr. Hitler, he basically created World War I, or World War II, I should say. And then back in 1941, he turned on his ally, which happened to be Stalin, and he attacked, of course, Russia. Now, Russia originally was pretty beaten up by the Germans, but you have to understand, Russia has tremendous resources, and they have tremendous amounts of people. They got 150 million people. And when you have 150 million people and you have vast resources, you can, of course, begin a war machine. And that's what they did. And when the Russians, of course, were able to overwhelm the the German armies, you know what happened? They basically not only took over, for example, Poland, they took over Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania, and they created what we call the Soviet bloc, or the Iron Curtain, including East Germany. Now, what happened was of course, to maintain that amount of resources, they basically became bankrupt in the late 80s. Okay. In the 1970s, they were still quite a formidable force. And as well, they were, had all these satellite countries to, of course, help feed them. But the problem was to maintain a military and keep that going, it takes a tremendous amount of money, and especially when you have to keep up with the US. So what happened was, over time, especially during the 1980s, under the leadership of the American president Ronald Reagan, when he came into power, you know what he said? He says, we're going to make America great. Now, doesn't that sound like what was going on these days? So basically, what happened was Ronald Reagan was in charge for 8 years, and he got the American economy back going, and also as well, he got the American military back on track. And so Russia, of course, had to counter that, but they didn't have the resources and they didn't have the people. And that's the other part, is Russia has always been about half the size of America when it comes to population. America, for example, has about 340 million people. Russia right now has about 145 million. So you see the problem? When you have more people, and of course, America is the #1 economy in the world. So there's an imbalance going on. Now, what happened was Gorbachev, who was the leader at that time after Brezhnev had died, Brezhnev had kept all of this a secret, and Gorbachev took over and realized that this was unsustainable. So what did he do? He allowed some of the different countries that were under what we would call the Soviet satellite system, that being countries under his leadership. He said, you guys have to fend for yourselves. And one of those countries was Ukraine. And so when the Iron Curtain came down, the Ukrainian people instantaneously, and also right, in their mindset, created the country of Ukraine, where we find ourselves right now. Now, if you've been oppressed for a couple of hundred years and you get this chance, of course, to liberate yourself, that's exactly what you're going to do. Now, what happened was, of course, during that time period, Ukraine said, we're going to stay neutral, which was perfectly fine with Gorbachev. It was perfectly fine with Yeltsin, and it was actually perfectly fine with Putin into the early years. But then as NATO expanded to the east towards, of course, Russia, they felt more, of course, pushed. And the final straw, as far as Russia was concerned, was when Ukraine said, well, we're considering NATO membership. And that's when Mr. Putin said, enough is enough. And he invaded Ukraine under two guises. Number one is that he was regaining Russian territory. And number two, he was, of course, claiming that this neutrality situation was no longer, and he said, you guys are not going to become members of NATO. And under those two premises, he attacked, of course. And so now we're coming up to 3 years, which actually, if you want to look at it, the war started in 2014, but the official attack was in 2021. We're coming up 3 years, and both sides have lost hundreds of thousands of people. And it's not a very good situation. And then, of course, in the Middle East, we had the October 7th situation, the attack of Hamas on Israel, and that all began to happen. And so here we are heading into 2025. 2024, for example, in the Middle East was quite the situation. When you look at what's going on in the Middle East right now, and in 2024, you have Israel pounding the daylights, literally turning Gaza into, a wasteland. That's literally what they've done. And then you have them attacking Hamas. Now you have to understand, in the minds of the Israel people, there is something that they have said, and you got to understand this, okay? During World War II, Israel was, of course, it didn't exist. The Jewish people lost 6 million people in the gas chambers and under the rule of the Nazis. 6 million of them died. So when they were liberated from the different parts of Europe where they were liberated, they got a chance to go back to the Middle East and create a state of their own, which they did in 1948. Now, they were attacked immediately from different Arab countries, and miraculously, they survived. Now, David Ben-Gurion, who happened to be the leader of Israel at the time, he said, listen, we're never going to allow this to happen again. In the mindset of the Israeli people, they were not going to allow another Holocaust. Now, fast forward to October the 7th. You have Hamas and all their, different people that came out, that terrorist organization. They blew out of Gaza. They killed almost 1,300 people and took 250 people, of course, captive. So what would you do? Well, we know, for example, what the Americans did after 9/11. They literally went out into Afghanistan and took Afghanistan. They took Iraq, and the Americans have been basically beating up people ever since then. They said, never going to happen again. So you see, in the mindset of someone who has been, of course, attacked, and you know how, if you've ever had something stolen from you, the first thing is you feel vulnerable. Secondly, you want to get revenge. That's the most natural thing. But you know what we need to do? We need to recognize what went on. So in the Middle East, of course, what was going on was Israel began to retaliate. And they retaliated very strongly. And from day one, when they went into Gaza, they had a northern neighbor. That northern neighbor, of course, was Hezbollah. Hezbollah and Israel, they fought a war back in 2006. And they basically came to a stalemate, is what happened. Well, during the next several years, Hezbollah built up through their sponsor, Iran, into this great, big, huge network. Now, also as well, Hezbollah sent about 30,000 fighters into Syria to bolster, of course, Mr. Assad. And then what happened was they kept shooting these rockets across the northern territories into the northern part of the Galilee, and they were shooting them from Lebanon. Israel had 60,000 people displaced. And as Israel was gaining the upper hand over Gaza, they also made a decision that they were going to do something about Hezbollah. And that's when we started having the bombing in Lebanon and all the stuff that went on in, of course, Lebanon. And what happened was simply this, is that near the end of November, you had Hezbollah saying, we've got to have a ceasefire. They lost Nasrallah, their leadership, and Israel was eliminating all their upper echelon leadership. Assassinating was what they were doing. And so basically they said, we've got to have a ceasefire. Now that ceasefire has been violated by both sides continuously, okay? But each one is blaming each other, and that's what happens when you have two parties that are not crazy about each other. So basically, Hezbollah gave up. Then we have near the end of November, and this was a story that came from Reuters. They basically said that Mr. Assad got on an airplane on November 28th and headed up to Moscow. And he said to Mr. Putin, he said, Mr. Putin, we are in a very precarious position. First of all, Hezbollah, which was standing behind us, is now a former shadow of itself. And Iran, who decided to, take on Israel in a couple of attacks, they are reeling because of the fact that, they have economic problems, they have social problems, they have a new president who has not got this appetite to, continue fighting. And so we need some help. And Mr. Putin said to Mr. Assad, listen, I can't help you. He says, I'm fighting this meat grinder war in Ukraine, and we just don't have the resources to do this. So he flies over to Tehran and says, can you help us? They said, no, we can't help you. So what does he do? He gets on an airplane. He leaves his wife up there in Moscow, and he flies down back to Damascus. And basically what he does, according to the reports that were given, he doesn't tell his senior staff what's going on. They come to him and they say, are we going to get the help? He said, oh yeah, we got the help. No problem at all. Iran is going to be with us. Russia is going to be with us. But that wasn't true. What happened was he got his state of affairs, in order. He got his money to where he needed to go. He needed, to do all those things. His final certain things that you have to do to clear up business. Then he got on an airplane. And most people thought, oh, he's just going to fly over to the Russian base and, secure some help there. No, he flew into the Russian base, got on an airplane, and headed up to, of course, Moscow. And that's where he is right now, leaving both him and leaving all his officials, and part of them is Syria. And Syria fell, Damascus fell. And now, of course, we are a month later, and the Syrian people are trying to put their country back together. For Syria, it's a marvelous situation because now they have a certain amount of freedom and they're enjoying it. And the provisional government, just yesterday, the leader of the interim government, he met with the Christian minority, and he also met with the Kurdish minority and had conversations with them. And both leaders of the Christian community and also as well the Kurdish community says, you know what, maybe we can work with this guy. So as we head into 2025, at least for the Syrian people, it's a pretty good situation. They have been under the oppression of the Assad family since 1970. So having this type of freedom is a real bone of good things for them coming ahead. So Paul says to us as we head into 2025, he says, forget those things which are behind, okay? You can't do anything about them anyway. Sitting there and worrying about something that happened in 2024 isn't going to benefit you in 2025. Now, there may be some things that you have left over from 2024, business situations, family situations, job situations that you may have to, deal with. But you got a brand new year. Now, I want to give you a little thought here, And it's based on Lamentations 3:23. The background of Lamentations 3:23 is this, okay? Jeremiah, who is the writer of Lamentations, says this. He says, the mercies of God are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. So what is he saying? Every day you have a brand new opportunity. And the one thing that you will find is the faithfulness of God. Now, the backstory of the book of Lamentations is, of course, the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, because they were two separate nations. Israel had gone into captivity under the Assyrians about 80 years before. Now, what was happening is the Babylonians, which were the world power at that time, had taken over the area of Jerusalem and Judea. But they had this king whose name was Zedekiah. And Zedekiah had 11-year reign. And under his reign, he was trying to get Egypt and other countries to come and help him and throw off the yoke of the Babylonians. Now, the Babylonians, of course, is like United States these days, okay? You don't fool around with them. And so when Nebuchadnezzar found this out, he says, I am going to deal decisively with the Judean threat. So he brings his massive army down towards Jerusalem. And Jeremiah, who was the prophet at the time, kept saying, listen, guys, this is an unwinnable situation. Now, there was, of course, Jewish nationalism. And they said, well, God's not going to abandon us. God is not going to let us go into captivity. That happened up there in the northern tribe because they turned away from God. But we've got the temple here. We've got Jerusalem. There's no way this is going to happen. And here is Jeremiah saying, listen, you guys are full of idolatry. You're basically, you are idol worshipers, you are worshipers of yourself, you are rebellious, you are unfaithful, and all of those things. And basically they said, oh, no, we're God's people, so we're not going to, they were God's people in name only. They were cultural Jews. So they were secular Jews. That's what's going on in Israel right now. There's a large contingent of the Jewish people that they are Jewish in culture, they're Jewish in name, but when it comes to following God, they say, well, I'm a secular Jew. So that's what was happening back then, and that's what's happening today. So what happened was Nebuchadnezzar came down and he completely and totally destroyed both the city of Jerusalem and took the entire area of Judah. And in those days, what they did was to destroy nationalism, and we still deal with nationalism today, and there's nothing wrong with nationalism. I'm a Canadian, okay? And I love my country of Canada. My dad fought in World War II to basically secure our freedom. My wife's dad fought in World War II. So we have strong ties to the military. We have strong ties to, of course, our nationalism. We celebrate, of course, November 11th, Remembrance Day, every year as a family. We've implanted that into the psyche of our kids and our grandkids, how important it is. And that freedom doesn't come and, just hoping. There is a price for freedom. So anyway, nationalism was very much as part of the Jewish psyche. So what happens was, in the ancient world, what they would do is they would transport you someplace else. That's what happened to Daniel. Daniel ended up in Babylon. And the reason why he ended up in Babylon is because he was part of the Jewish aristocracy and nobility, and he was transferred into Babylon. And then what they would do is they'd bring other people in and settle them into the area so that they would not develop this particular national fervor. And also as well, the Jewish people had the temple. That was their center of worship. When Daniel, for example, was praying the 3 times a day, he would always look to the west. He would always pray towards the temple. That was a Jewish symbol of religion and also his faith. So anyway, he saw the temple literally torn apart. He saw the walls torn down. He saw the people transported from Judah to wherever Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to go. And the Lord was good to him. He was allowed to stay because they had heard, that being the Babylonians, they had heard, he said, listen, you guys got to, think about this. Well, anyway, Jeremiah is watching this destruction and he's lamenting. A lament is basically a written account of the brokenness of a heart. And so he's lamenting and he says this, in the middle of all this lament, he says, the mercies of God are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. What's he trying to say? He's trying to say, listen, it doesn't matter what your situation is. It doesn't matter what you faced yesterday. David put it this way. He says, sorrow is for a night, but joy comes in the morning. So whether it is David, whether it is Jeremiah or Paul, they're saying, listen, what happened yesterday is in the past. You need to leave it in the past. It's not going to change your present situation. You've got to deal with whatever it is that you have to deal with today. And as we head into a brand new year, let's forget those things which are behind. And let's press towards that which is ahead. Because what is ahead can be very, very exciting, especially when you know that you have divine help and divine intervention. I've been serving the Lord since 1974, and I celebrated, believe it or not, 50 years of doing this craziness. Sometimes I'm absolutely amazed at the goodness of God. And every year, I walk into that brand new year with hope. You see, 1 Corinthians 13:13 says, these three remain: faith, hope, and love. I love that. The reason I love that is because of the fact which this is wonderful, demonstrated love that God gave me. I can't believe that He would love me and that He would want to be a part of my daily life. I've had this wonderful journey for decades. And I can tell you over and over and over again. Can I tell you a story that I just read today from a family member? This family member, of course, is a family member through marriage. His name is Ben. And Ben was telling us in his story about how when he was 18 years old, he was he had decided to go sledding, okay, or tobogganing, or sliding, whatever you call it. And he decided to take one of those old lids that you had on the wringer washer. They usually were about 2.5 feet, and they were metal. And when you go down a hill, boy, you can scream. So anyway, he was 18 years old at the time, and he went to one of the local ski hills or local sledding hills around British Columbia where they live. And of course, British Columbia has lots of mountains around and lots of hills to go sledding. What happened was he decided to go down a particular hill. And as he was going down the hill, he hit the ice too fast and he ran straight into a wall. And basically, he ended up hearing this crack noise. And he knew instantaneously he had pain. It was bad. And he was mad. He was mad at God. He was mad at himself. He was mad at the situation. Anyway, the paramedics came and they put him on one of the backboards and they took him to, of course, the hospital. And he couldn't feel anything in his legs. He knew that he was in rough shape. He was basically paralyzed, is what happened. And so there he is in the hospital. Now, fortunately, he was part of a Christian family, and they got the news, and they all came to the hospital. He was not pleasant at all, he said. He said, I was mad. He was mad at God. He was mad at himself. He was mad over the situation. Why did this happen? I'm 18 years old. I can't work, etc., etc. And it was a bad situation. He couldn't feel anything in his feet. And then when they finally got him all straightened out, literally, they discovered that his leg, his one leg, because of the injury, was 7 inches shorter than the other leg. And they were saying, well, what are we going to do? All of a sudden, he says, one of the pastors from his church, an assistant pastor, came and he looked at the situation. He says, he didn't, grab my leg and pull it out or anything like that. It was a very gentle encounter. He says, because that was what was needed at the time. You know, that's the beautiful thing about God. God always brings the right person at the right time with the right attitude to do the right thing. That's the beautiful thing about the Lord. And he said, this guy was absolutely beautiful, absolutely gentle. He knew exactly what to do. And so he said, let's gather around. So the people gathered around, and he laid his hands on both the knee and also the foot. And he simply said, Lord, would you right now restore my brother Ben? You see, he's 18 years old and he's got his entire life ahead of him. Would you do that? All of a sudden, the whole audience, as the prayer was being offered, heard a crack. And all of a sudden, right in front of their eyes, they saw a creative miracle. I read that today. And he was just sharing about the fact that God was good. In front of their eyes, they saw his leg grow out 7 inches. 7 inches from, it was incredible, 7 inches. He says the pain disappeared. And he says, I felt no pain at all after that. He says, 3 weeks later, I was back at work. Now that is a real miracle. And you see, sometimes the situations that we find ourselves in, now that doesn't happen all the time. Just get me straight, okay? That doesn't happen all the time. But every once in a while, God intervenes just to remind us about the fact that he is large and in charge. And when I read that, I said, thank you for sharing that, Ben. Thank you so very much for doing that, to just remind us about the goodness of God. Here was a guy whose attitude actually stunk. A guy who was angry at God, angry at himself, angry at the world, and God still healed him. That is grace in its greatest form. That's why I love the Lord, because I responded to his love. Let me just tell you this. You and I have an opportunity to respond to his love every day. And in turn, what we can do is we can show that love to those that come across our path. And believe me, everybody that comes across our path is not lovely. God, from time to time, brings sandpaper people into our situation. And then what that does for us is this. It allows us to all of a sudden realize that it's the love of God that can get us through. Now, the love of God also, as we respond to it, you know what happens? What happens is this. All of a sudden, we start walking by faith. We're not walking in our own understanding. And please understand, faith is a communicated attribute of God, okay? It's something that's like the grace of God. It's a gift. Now, there's what we call natural faith. For example, my wife today, she's on her way down to my daughter's home in Killam. And she is going to, of course, be able to, travel in her car. I believe that her car will get her there because I've done everything I can to get it ready. But you see, we all have faith that we're going to start our cars and it's going to start, that when we turn on the thermostat, the furnace is going to work, and all of those things. That is faith. And as we walk by faith, you know what happens? We begin to have hope. Hope, which is our future. So as we head into 2025, we're there now. What I want you to do is I want you to walk by faith. I want you to walk in love and cultivate the hope that you have within us. That's what Paul says. He says, cultivate the hope that is within you. Understand that as you trust the Lord and don't lean to your own understanding, simply acknowledge him, he will direct your path. That is a wonderful way to look at 2025. So whatever state you find yourself in today in 2025, wherever you find yourself, remember, you're not alone in this journey. You've got someone with you. Well, if you like what you've been hearing, I always encourage you to press the like button and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. Lord, I just want to pray a very simple prayer right now. For those who have been watching and are heading into 2025, would you be with each one? Would you keep each one and touch each one in a very powerful way? And I ask all these things right now in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if you like what you see, press the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. My name is Robert Dean Steele. Thank you so much for joining me today, and have yourself a great and godly day.